Test. Chapter 27, The 60s. 1. Introduction. Perhaps no decade is so immortalized in American memory as the 1960s. Couched in colorful rhetoric of peace and love, complemented by stirring images of the civil rights movement, and fondly remembered for its music, art, and activism, the decade brought many people hope for a more inclusive, forward-thinking nation. But the decade was also plagued by strife, tragedy, and chaos. It was the decade of the Vietnam War, inner-city riots, and assassinations that seemed to symbolize the crushing of a new generation's idealism. A decade of struggle and disillusionment rocked by social, cultural, and political upheaval. The 1960s are remembered because so much changed and because so much did not. 2. Kennedy and Cuba. The decade's political landscape began with a watershed presidential election. Americans were captivated by the 1960 race between Republican Vice President Richard Nixon and Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy. Two candidates who pledged to move the nation forward and invigorate an economy experiencing the worst recession since the Great Depression. Kennedy promised to use federal programs to strengthen the economy and address pockets of long-standing poverty, while Nixon called for a reliance on private enterprise and reduction of government spending. Both candidates faced criticism as well. Nixon had to defend Dwight Eisenhower's domestic policies, while Kennedy, who was attempting to become the first Catholic president, had to counteract questions about his faith and convince voters he was experienced enough to lead. One of the most notable events of the Nixon-Kennedy presidential campaign was the televised debate in September, the first of its kind between major presidential candidates. The debate focused on domestic policy and provided Kennedy with an important moment to present himself as a composed, knowledgeable statesman. In contrast, Nixon, an experienced debater who faced higher expectations, looked sweaty and defensive. Radio listeners famously thought the two men performed equally well, but the TV audience was much more impressed by Kennedy, giving him an advantage in subsequent debates. Ultimately, the election was extraordinarily close. In the largest voter turnout in American history up to that point, Kennedy bested Nixon by less than 1 percentage point. Although Kennedy's lead in the electoral votes was more comfortable at 303 to 219, the Democratic Party's victory did not translate in Congress, where Democrats lost a few seats in both houses. As a result, Kennedy entered office in 1961 without the mandate necessary to achieve the ambitious agenda he would refer to as the New Frontier. Kennedy also faced foreign policy challenges. The United States entered the 1960s unaccustomed to stark foreign policy failures, having emerged from World War II as a global superpower before waging a Cold War against the Soviet Union in the 1950s. In the new decade, unsuccessful conflicts in Cuba and Vietnam would yield embarrassment, fear, and tragedy, stunning a nation that experienced triumph and altering the way many thought of America's role in international affairs. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro and his Revolutionary Army initiated a new era of Cuban history. Having ousted the corrupt Cuban president Fulgencio Batista, who had fled Havana on New Year's Eve, Castro and his rebel forces made their way triumphantly through the capital city's streets. In the United States, which had propped up Batista's corrupt regime, withdrawn support and initially expressed sympathy for Castro's new government, which was immediately granted diplomatic recognition. But President Dwight Eisenhower and members of his administration were wary. The new Cuban government soon instituted leftist economic policies centered on agrarian reform, land redistribution, and the nationalization of private enterprises. Cuba's wealthy and middle-class citizens fled the island in droves. Many settled in Miami, Florida, and other American cities. The relationship between Cuba and the United States deteriorated rapidly. On October 9, 1960, the United States instituted a near-total trade embargo to economically isolate the Cuban regime. And in January 1961, the two nations broke off formal diplomatic relations. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, acting under the mistaken belief that the Castro government lacked popular support and Cuban citizens would revolt if given the opportunity, began to recruit members of the exiled community and to participate in an invasion of the island. On April 6, 1961, an invasion force consisting primarily of Cuban immigrants landed on Giron Beach on the Bay of Pigs. Cuban soldiers and civilians quickly overwhelmed the exiles, many of whom were taken prisoner. The Cuban government's success of thwarting the Bay of Pigs invasion did much to legitimize the new regime and was a tremendous embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. As the political relationship between Cuba and the United States disintegrated, the Castro government became more closely aligned with the Soviet Union. This strengthening of ties set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps the most dramatic foreign policy crisis in the history of the United States. In 1962, in response to the United States' long-time maintenance of a nuclear arsenal in Turkey and at the invasion of the Cuban government, the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. On October 14, 1962, American spy planes detected the construction of missile launch sites, and on October 22nd, President Kennedy addressed the American people to alert them of this threat. Over the course of the next several days, the world watched in horror as the United States and Soviet Union hovered on the brink of nuclear war. Finally, on October 28th, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. agreement to remove its missiles from Turkey and a formal pledge that the United States would not invade Cuba, and the crisis was resolved peacefully. Though the Cuban Missile Crisis temporarily halted the flow of Cuban refugees, immigration began again in earnest in the mid-1960s. In 1965, the Johnson administration and the Castro government brokered a deal that facilitated the reunion of families that had been separated by earlier waves of migration, opening the door for thousands to leave the island. In 1966, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Cuban Adjustment Act, allowing Cuban refugees to become permanent residents. Over the course of the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Cubans left their homeland and built new lives in America. 3. The Civil Rights Movement continues. So much of the energy and character of the 60s emerged from the Civil Rights Movement, which won its greatest victories in the early years of the decade. The movement itself was changing. Many of those civil rights activists pushing for school desegregation in the 1950s were middle class and middle aged. In the 1960s, a new student movement arose whose members wanted swifter changes in the segregated South. Confrontational protests, marches, boycotts, and sit-ins accelerated. The tone of the modern U.S. civil rights movement changed at the North Carolina department store in 1960 when 4 African American students participated in a sit-in at a whites-only lunch counter. The 1960 Greenboro sit-ins were typical. Activists sat at a segregated lunch counters in an act of defiance, refusing to leave until being served and willing to be ridiculed, attacked, and arrested if they were not. The tactic drew resistance but forced the desegregation of Woolworth's department stores. It prompted copycat demonstrations across the South. The protests offered evidence that student-led direct action could enact social change and establish the civil rights movement's direction in the forthcoming years. The following year, civil rights advocates attempted a bolder variation of a sit-in when they participated in the Freedom Rides. Activists organized interstate bus rides following a Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation on public schools, public buses, and trains. The rides intended to test the court's rulings, which many southern states had ignored. An interracial group of Freedom Riders boarded buses in Washington, D.C. with the intention of sitting in integrated patterns on the buses as they moved through the Deep South. On the initial rides of May 1961, the riders encountered fierce resistance in Alabama. Angry mob composed of KKK members attacked riders in Birmingham, burning one of the buses and beating activists who escaped. Additional freedom lines launched through the summer and generated national attention amid additional violent resistance. Ultimately, the Interstate Commerce Commission enforced the integrated interstate bus and trains in November 1961. In the fall of 1961, civil rights activists descended on Albany, a small city in the southwest of Georgia. Known for entrenched segregation and racial violence, Albany seemed an unlikely place for Black Americans to rally and demand change. The activists there, however, formed the Albany Movement, a coalition of civil rights activists and organizers that include the members of the Student Nonviolence Coordinates Committee, SNCC, or SNCC, the SCLC, and the NAACP. But the movement was stymied by the Albany police chief, Lori Pritchett, who launched a mass arrest but refused to engage in police brutality and bailed out leading officials to avoid negative media attention. It was a particular scene and a lesson for Southern activists. The Albany movement included elements of Christian commitment to social justice in its platform, with activists saying they were all people of equal worth in God's family, and no man may discriminate against or exploit another. In many instances in the 1960s, Black Christianity propelled civil rights advocates to action and demonstration, the significance of religion to the broader civil rights movement. King's rise of the prominence underscored the role of African American religious figures played in the 1960s civil rights movement. Protesters sang hymns and spirituals as they marched. Preachers rallied all messages of justice and hope. Churches hosted meetings, prayer vigils, and conferences on nonviolent resistance. The moral thrust of the movement strengthened African American activists and confronted white society by framing segregation as a moral evil. As the civil rights movement garnered support and followers and more attention, white resistance stiffened. In October 1962, James Meredith became the first African American to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Meredith's enrollment sparked riots on the Oxford campus, promoting John S. Kennedy to send the U.S. Marshals and National Guardsmen to maintain order. On an evening known infamously as the Battle of Old Miss, segregationists clashed with troops in the middle of campus, resulting in 2 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Violence served as a reminder of the strength of the white resistance to the civil rights movement, particularly in the realm of education. The following year, 1963, was perhaps the decade's most eventful year for civil rights. In April and May, the SCLC organized the Birmingham Campaign, a broad campaign of direct action aiming to topple segregation in Alabama's largest city. Activists used business boycotts, sit-ins, and peaceful marches as part of the campaign. SCLC leader Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed, prompting his famous handwritten letter urging not only his nonviolent approach, but active confrontation directly challenged justice. The campaign further added to King's national reputation and featured powerful photographs and video footage of white police officers using fire hoses and attack dogs on young African American protesters. It also yielded an agreement to desegregate public accommodations in the city. Activists in Birmingham scored a victory of civil rights and drew international praise for the nonviolent approach in the face of police-sanctioned violence and bombings. White resistance intensified. While much of the rhetoric of the 1960s focused on a younger, more liberal generation's progressive ideas, conservatism maintained a strong presence on the American political scene. Few political figures in the decade embodied the working-class conservative views held by millions of white Americans, quite like George Wallace. Wallace's vocal stance on segregation was immortalized in his 1960 inaugural address as Alabama governor, with the phrase, "segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Just as the civil rights movement began to gain unprecedented strength, Wallace became the champion of many white Southerners opposed to the movement. Consequently, Wallace was one of the best examples of the very real opposition to civil rights activists faced in the late 20th century. As governor, Wallace loudly supported segregation. His efforts were symbolic, but they earned him national recognition as a political figure willing to fight for what many Southerners saw as their traditional way of life. In June 1963, just 5 months after becoming governor, his stand in the schoolhouse door, Wallace's family stood at the front door of the Foster Auditorium to protest integration at the University of Alabama. President Kennedy addressed the nation that evening, criticizing Wallace and calling for a comprehensive civil rights bill. A day later, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was assassinated in his home of Jackson, Mississippi. That summer, civil rights leaders organized the August 1963 March on Washington. The march called for, among other things, civil rights legislation, school integration, and end to discrimination by public and private employers, job training for the unemployed, and a raise to the minimum wage. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, an internationally renowned call for civil rights that raised the movement's profile to new heights and put unprecedented pressure on politicians to pass meaningful civil rights legislation. Kennedy offered support for the Civil Rights Bill, but Southern resistance was intense, and Kennedy was unwilling to spend much political capital on it. so the bill stalled in Congress. Then, on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation's youthful, popular president was gone. Vice President Lyndon Johnson lacked Kennedy's youth, his charisma, his popularity, and his aristocratic upbringing. But no one in Washington knew better, and no one before or since fought harder and more successfully to pass meaningful civil rights legislation. Raised in poverty in the Texas Hill Country, Johnson scratched and clawed his way up the political ladder. He was both ruthlessly ambitious and keenly conscious of poverty and justice. He idolized Franklin Roosevelt, whose New Deal had brought about improvements for the impoverished Central Texans Johnson grew up with. President Lyndon Johnson, then an old white Southerner with a thick Texas drawl, embraced the civil rights movement. He took Kennedy's stalled civil rights bill, ensured that it would have teeth, and navigated it through Congress. The following summer, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, widely considered to be one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. The Comprehensive Act barred segregation in public accommodations and outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, and national or religious origin. The civil rights movement created space for political leaders to pass legislation, and the movement continued pushing forward. Direct action continued through the summer of 1964 as student-run organizations like SNCC and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, helped with the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, a drive to register African-American voters in the state with an ugly history of discrimination. Freedom Summer campaigners set up schools for African-American children. Even with progress, intimidation and violent resistance against the civil rights continued, particularly in regions with long-standing traditions of segregation. In March 1965, activists attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, on behalf of local African-American voting rights. A narrative that had become familiar, Bloody Sunday, featured peaceful protesters attacked by white law enforcement with batons and tear gas. After they were turned away violently for a second time, marchers finally made their 50-mile trek to the state capitol later in the month. Coverage of the first march prompted President Johnson to present the bill that became the Voting Rights Act of 1965, an act that abolished voting rights discrimination in federal, state, and local elections. In 2 consecutive years, landmark pieces of legislation had assaulted de jure segregation by law and disenfranchisement. Pardon me. 4. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. On a May morning in 1964, President Johnson laid out a sweeping vision for a package of domestic reforms known as Great Society. Speaking before that year's graduates at the University of Michigan, Johnson called for an end to poverty and racial injustice. The challenge both the graduates and the American people to enrich lives and elevate our national life, and to advance the equality of our American civilization. At its heart, he promised the Great Society would uplift racially and economically disenfranchised Americans, too long denied access to federal guarantees of equal democratic and economic opportunity, while simultaneously raising all American standards and quality of life. The Great Society's legislation was breathtaking in scope, and many of its programs and agencies are still with us today. Most importantly, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 codified federal support for many of the civil rights movement's goals by prohibiting job discrimination, abolishing the segregation of public accommodations, and providing vigorous federal oversight of the southern states' election laws in order to guarantee minority access to the ballot. 90 years after Reconstruction, these measures effectively ended Jim Crow. In addition to civil rights, the Great Society took on a range of quality of life concerns that seemed suddenly solvable in a society of such affluence. It established the first federal food stamp program. Medicare and Medicaid would ensure access to quality medical care for the aged and poor. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was the first sustained and significant federal investment in public education, totaling more than $1 billion. Significant funds were poured into colleges and universities. The Great Society also established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, federal investments in arts and letters that fund American cultural expression to this day. While these programs persisted and even thrived in the years immediately following this flurry of legislative activity, the national conversation surrounding Johnson's domestic agenda largely focused on the $3 billion spent on the war poverty programming with the Great Society's Economic Opportunity Program, EOA, of 1964. No EOA program was more controversial than the Community Action, considered the cornerstone of the anti-poverty program. Johnson's anti-poverty planners felt that the key to uplifting disenfranchised and impoverished Americans was providing poor and marginal citizens in the actual administration of poverty programs what they called maximum feasible participation. Community action programs would give disenfranchised Americans a seat at the table in planning and executing federally funded programs that were meant to benefit them. A significant sea change in the nation's effort to confront poverty, which has historically relied on local politicians and business elites or charitable organizations for administration. In fact, Johnson himself had never conceived of poor Americans running their own poverty programs. While the president's rhetoric offered a stirring vision of the future, he had a singularly old-school notion for how his poverty programs would work. In contrast to the maximum feasible participation, the president imagined a second New Deal. Local elite-run public work camps that would instill masculine virtues in unemployed young men. Community action was almost entirely bypassed local administrations and sought to build grassroots civil rights support and community advocacy organizations, many of which had originated in the broader civil rights movement. Despite widespread support for most Great Society programs, the war on poverty increasingly became a focal point of domestic criticisms from the right and left. On the left, frustrated Americans recognized the president's resistance further empowering poor minority communities and also assailed the growing war in Vietnam, the cost of which was undercutting domestic spending. As racial unrest and violence swept urban centers, critics from the right lambasted federal spending as unworthy citizens. For unworthy citizens. Johnson had secured a series of meaningful civil rights legislation laws, but then things began to stall. Days after ratifying the Voting Rights Act, race riots broke out in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Rioting in Watts stemmed from local African American frustrations with residential segregation, police brutality, and racial profiling. Waves of riots rocked American cities every summer thereafter. Particularly destructive riots occurred in 1967, 2 summers later in Newark and Detroit. Each resulted in deaths, injuries, arrests, and millions of dollars in property damage. In spite of Black achievements, problems persisted for many African Americans. The phenomenon of white flight, when whites in a metropolitan area fled city centers for the suburbs, often resulted in resegregated residential patterns. Limited access to economic and social opportunities in urban areas bred discord. In addition to reminding the nations that civil rights movement was a complex, ongoing event without a concrete endpoint, the unrest in northern cities reinforced the nation that the struggle did not occur solely in the South. Many Americans also viewed the riots as an indictment of Great Society, President Johnson's sweeping agenda of domestic programs that sought to remedy inner-city ills by offering better access to jobs, education, medical care, housing, and other forms of welfare. The civil rights movement was never the same. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the war on poverty provoked conservative resistance that were catalysts for the rise of Republicans in the South and West. However, subsequent presidents and Congress have left intact the bulk of Great Society, including Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, federal spending for arts and literature, and Head Start. Even community action programs, so fraught during their first few short years of activity, inspired and empowered a new generation of minority and poverty community activists who had never before felt, as one put it, that this government is with us. 5. The origins of the Vietnam War. American involvement in the Vietnam War began during the post-war period of decolonization. The Soviet Union backed many nationalist movements across the globe, but the United States feared that the expansion of communist influence and pledged to confront any revolutions aligned against Western capitalism. The domino theory, the idea that if a country failed to communism, its neighboring states would soon follow, governed American foreign policy. After the communist takeover of China in 1949, the United States financially supported the French military's effort to retain control over its colonies in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Between 1946 and 1954, France fought a counterinsurgency campaign against the nationalist Viet Minh forces led by Ho Chi Minh. The United States assisted the French war efforts with funds, arms, and advisors, but it was not enough. On the eve of the Geneva Peace Conference in 1954, Viet Minh forces defeated the French army at Dien Bien Pho. The conference temporarily divided Vietnam into two separate states until a UN-monitored elections occurred. But the United States feared a communist electoral victory and blocked the elections. The temporary partition became permanent. The United States established the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, with the US-backed Ngo Dinh Diem as prime minister. Diem, who had lived in the United States, was a committed anti-communist. Diem's government, however, and its Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, could not contain the communist insurgency seeking the reunification of Vietnam. The Americans provided weapons and support, but despite a clear numerical and technological advantage, South Vietnam stumbled before the insurgent Viet Cong VC units. Diem, a corrupt leader propped up by the American government with little domestic support, was assassinated in 1963. A merry-go-round of military dictators followed as the situation in southern Vietnam continued to deteriorate. The American public, though, remained largely unaware of Vietnam until the early 1960s, even as President John F. Kennedy deployed some 16,000 military advisors to help South Vietnam suppress a domestic communist insurgency. This all changed in 1964. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox reported incoming fire from North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the details of the incident are controversial, the Johnson administration exploited the event to provide a pretext for escalating the American involvement in Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson the authority to deploy the American military to defend southern Vietnam. U.S. Marines landed in Vietnam in March 1965, and the American ground war began. American forces under General William Westmoreland were tasked with defending southern Vietnam against the insurgent Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese army. No matter how many troops the Americans sent or how many bombs they deployed, they could not win. This was a different kind of war. Progress was not measured by cities won or territory taken but by body counts and kill ratios. Although American officials like Westmoreland and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara claimed a communist defeat was on the horizon, by 1968, 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam, nearly 20,000 had been killed, and the war was no closer to being won. Protests, which would provide the backdrop for the American counterculture, erupted across the country. 6. Culture and activism. The 1960s wrought enormous cultural change. The United States that entered the decade looked and sounded little like the one that it left. Rebellion locked the supposedly hidebound conservatism of the 1950s as the youth counterculture became mainstream. Native Americans, Chicanos, women, and environmentalists participated in movements demonstrating that rights activism could be applied to ethnicity, gender, and nature. Even established religious institutions, such as the Catholic Church, underwent transformations, emphasizing freedom and tolerance. In each instance, the decade brought substantial progress and evidence that activism remained fluid and unfinished. Much of the counterculture was filtered through popular culture and consumption. The 50s consumer culture still saturated the country, and advisors continued to appeal to teenagers and the expanding youth market. During the 1960s, though, advertisers looked to a growing counterculture to sell their products. Popular culture and popular advertising in the 1950s had promoted the ethos of fitting in and buying products to conform. The new counterculture ethos touted individuality and rebellion. Some advertisers were subtle. Ads for Volkswagens acknowledged the flaws and strange look of the cars. One ad read, "Presenting America's slowest fastback," which won't go over 72 miles per hour, even though the speedometer shows wildly optimistic top speed of 90. Another stated, "And if you run out of gas, it's easy to push." By marketing the car's flaws and reframing them as positive qualities, the advertisers commercialized young people's resistance to commercialism while simultaneously positioning the VW as a car for those wanting to stand out in a crowd. A more obviously countercultural ad for the VW Bug showed two cars, one painted black and one painted multicolor in the hippie style, with contrasting captions that read, "We do our thing and you do yours." Companies marketed their products as countercultural in and of themselves. One of the more obvious examples was an ad in 1968 from Columbia Records, a hugely successful record label since the 1920s. The ad pictured a group of stock rebellious characters, a shaggy-haired white hippie, a button-up beat, two biker types, and a black man sporting an afro and a dial sail. The counterculture had been busted, the ad states, but the man can't bust our music. Merely buying records from Columbia was an act of rebellion, one that brought the buyer closer to the counterculture figures portrayed in the ad. But it wasn't just the advertising. The culture was changing and changing rapidly. Conservative cultural norms were failing everywhere. The dominant style of women's fashion in the 1950s, for instance, was the poodle skirt and sweater, tight-waisted and buttoned up. The 1960s ushered in an era of much less restrictive clothing. Capri pants became popular casual wear. Skirts became shorter. When Mary Quaint invented the miniskirt in 1964, she said the garment was in which you could move, in which you could run and jump. By the late 1960s, the hippies' more androgynous look became trendy. Such trends bespoke of the new popular cultural ethos of the 1960s, freedom, rebellion, and individuality. In a decade plagued by social and political instability, the American counterculture also saw psychedelic drugs as a remedy for alienation. For white middle-class teenagers, society had become stagnant and bureaucratic. The New Left, for instance, arose on college campuses frustrated with lifeless bureaucracies that they believed strangled true freedom. Lysergic acid diphenylate, LSD, began its life as a drug primarily used in psychological research between trickling down into college campuses and out into society at large. The counterculture's notion that American stagnation could be remedied in a spiritual psychedelic experience drew heavily from psychologists and sociologists. The popularity of these drugs also spurred political backlash. By 1966, enough incidents had been connected to LSD to spur a Senate hearing on the drug, and newspapers were reporting hundreds of LSD's users had been admitted to psychiatric wards. The counterculture conquered popular culture. Rock and roll liberalized sexuality and embrace of diversity, recreational drug use, and unalloyed idealism and pure earnestness marked a new generation. Criticized by conservatives as culturally dangerous and by leftists as empty narcissism, the youth culture nevertheless dominated headlines and steered American culture. Perhaps 100,000 youth descended on San Francisco for the utopic promise of 1967's Summer of Love. 1969's Woodstock concert in New York became shorthand for the new youth culture and its mixture of politics, protests, and personal fulfillment. While the adolescence of the hippies would be both exaggerated and short-lived, and while Vietnam and Richard Nixon shattered much of the idealism, the counterculture's liberated social norms and embrace of personal fulfillment still define much of American culture. Beyond civil rights. Despite substantial legislative achievements, frustrations with the slow pace of change grew. Tensions continued to mount in cities, and the tone of the civil rights movement began to change yet again. Activists became less conciliatory in their calls for progress. Many embraced more militant messaging of the burgeoning Black Power movement and the late Malcolm X, a Nation of Islam minister who would encourage African Americans to pursue freedom, equality, and justice by any means necessary. Prior to his death, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam emerged as the radical alternative to the racially integrated, largely Protestant approach of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm advocated armed resistance in defense of safety and the well-being of Black Americans, stating, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense, I call it intelligence." For his part, King and leaders from more mainstream organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League criticized both Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam for what they perceived to be racial demagogy. Pardon me. King believed Malcolm X's speeches were a great disservice to Black Americans, claiming that they lamented the problems of African Americans without offering solutions. The differences between King and Malcolm X represented the core ideological tension that would inhibit black political thought throughout the 1960s and 70s. One moment. By the late 1960s, the SNCC, led by figures such as Stokely Carmichael, had expelled its white members and shunned the interracial effort in rural South, instead focusing on injustices in northern urban areas. As President Johnson refused to take up the cause of black delegates in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, the SNCC activists became frustrated with the institutional tactics and turned away from the organization's founding principle of nonviolence. This evolved a more aggressive movement called for African Americans to play a dominant role in cultivating black institutions and articulating black interests, rather than relying on interracial moderate approaches. At a June 1966 civil rights march, Carmichael told the crowd, "What we gonna start saying now is black power." The slogan not only resonated with audiences, but it stood directly in contrast to King's Freedom Now campaign. The political slogan of black power could encompass many meanings, but at its core, it stood for the self-determination of black people in political, economic, and social organizations. Carmichael asserted that black power means black people coming together to form a political force. To others, it meant violence. In 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers had become the standard bearers for direct action and self-defense, using the concept of decolonialization and their drive to liberate black communities from white power structures. The revolutionary organization also sought reparations and exemptions for black men from the military draft. Citing police brutality and the racist government policies, the Black Panthers aligned themselves with other people of color in the world against whom America was fighting abroad. Although it was perhaps most well known for its display of weapons, military-style dress, and black nationalist beliefs, the party's 10-point plan also included employment, housing, and education. The Black Panthers worked in local communities to run survival programs that provided food, clothing, medical treatment, and drug rehabilitation. They focused on modes of resistance that empowered black activists on their own terms. But African Americans weren't the only Americans struggling to assert themselves in the 60s. The success of the civil rights movement and growing grassroots activism inspired countless movements. In the summer of 1961, for instance, frustrated Native American university students founded the National Indian Youth Council to draw attention to the plight of indigenous Americans. In the Pacific Northwest, the council advocated for tribal fishermen to retain immunity from conservation laws on the reservations, and in 1964 held a series of fish-ins. Activists and celebrities cast nets and waited for police to arrest them. The NIYC's militant rhetoric and use of direct action marked the beginning of what was called the Red Power Movement, an intertribal movement designed to draw attention to Native issues and protest discrimination. The American Indian movement and other activists staged dramatic demonstrations. By November 1969, dozens began a year-and-a-half-long occupation of the abandoned Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. In 1973, hundreds occupied the town of Woodney, South Dakota, the site of the infamous 1896 massacre, an 1890 massacre, for several months. Meanwhile, the Chicano movement in the 1960s emerged out of the broader Mexican-American civil rights movement of the post-World War II era. The word Chicano was initially considered a derogatory term for Mexican immigrants until activists in the 1960s reclaimed the term and used it as a catalyst for a campaign for political and social change among Mexican Americans. The Chicano movement confronted discrimination in schools, politics, agriculture, and other formal and informal institutions. Organizations like the Mexican American Political Association, MAPA, and the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund buoyed the Chicano movement and patterned themselves after similar influential groups in the African American civil rights movement. Cesar Chavez became the most well-known figure in the Chicano movement, using nonviolent tactics to campaign for workers' rights in the grape fields of California. Chavez and activist Dolores Huerta founded the National Farm Workers Association, which eventually merged and became the United Farm Workers of America. The UFWA fused the causes of Chicano and Filipino activists protesting the subpar working conditions of California farmers on American soil. In addition to embarking on a hunger strike and boycott of table grapes, Chavez led a 300-mile march in March and April of 1966 from Delano, California to the state capitol in Sacramento. The pro-labor movement campaign garnered a national spotlight and support from prominent political figures such as Robert Kennedy. Today, Chavez's birthday, March 31st, is observed as a federal holiday in California, Colorado, and Texas. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez was another activist whose calls for Chicano self-determination resonated long past the 1960s. A former boxer and Denver native, Gonzalez founded the Crusade for Justice in 1966, an organization that would establish the first annual Chicano Liberation Day and the National Chicano Youth Conference. The conference also yielded the Plan Espiritual de Aztlan and the Chicago Nationalist Manifesto that reflected Gonzalez's vision of Chicanos as a unified, historically grounded, all-encompassing group fighting against discrimination in the United States. By 1970, the Texas-based La Raza Unida political party had a strong foundation for promoting Chicano activism and continuing the campaign for Mexican-American civil rights. The feminist movement also grew in the 1960s. Women were active in both the civil rights movement and the labor movement, but their increasing awareness of gender inequality did not find a receptive audience among male leaders in those movements. In the 1960s, then, many of these women began to form movements of their own. Soon the country experienced a groundswell of feminist consciousness. One moment. An older generation of women who preferred to work within the state institutions figured prominently in the early years of the decade. When John F. Kennedy established the Presidential Committee on the Status of Women in 1961, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt headed the effort. The Commission's official report, a self-declared invitation to action, was released in 1963. Finding discriminatory provisions in law and practice of industrial, labor, and governmental organizations, the Commission advocated for changes, many of them long overdue, in the conditions of women's opportunity in the United States. Change was recommended in the area of employment practices, federal tax and benefits policies affecting women's income, labor laws, and the services for women as wives, mothers, and workers. This call to action, if heeded, would ameliorate the types of discrimination primarily experienced by middle-class and elite white working women, all of whom were used to advocating through institutional structures like government agencies and unions. The specific concerns of poor and non-white women lay largely beyond the scope of the report. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique hit bookshelves the same year as the Commission released its report. Friedan had been active in the union movements and was, by this time, a mother in the new suburban landscape of post-war America. In her book, Friedan labored the problem that has no name, and in doing so helped many white middle-class women come to see their dissatisfaction as housewives as not something wrong with their marriage or themselves, but instead as a social problem experienced by millions of American women. Friedan observes that there was a discrepancy between the reality of our lives as women and the image to which we were trying to conform, the image I call the feminine mystique. No longer would women allow society to blame the problem that has no name on a loss of femininity, too much education, or too much female independence and equality with men. The 1960s also saw different groups of women pushing for change in government policy. Mothers on Welfare began to form local advocacy groups in addition to the National Welfare Rights Organization founded in 1966. Mostly African American, these activists fought for greater benefits and more control over welfare policy and implementation. Women like Johnny Tillman successfully advocated for larger grants of school clothes and household equipment, in addition to gaining due process and fair administrative hearings prior to termination of welfare entitlements. Yet another mode of feminist activism was the formation of consciousness-raising groups. These groups met in women's homes and at women's centers, providing a safe environment for women to discuss everything from experiences of gender discrimination to pregnancy, from relationships with men and women to self-image. The goal of consciousness raising was to increase self-awareness and validate the experiences of women. Groups framed such individual experiences as examples of society-wide sexism and claimed the personal is political. Consciousness-raising groups created a wealth of personal stories that feminism could use in other forms of activism and crafted networks of women from which activists could mobilize and support for protests. By the end of the decade was marked by the Women's Strike for Equality, celebrating the 50th anniversary of women's right to vote. Sponsored by the National Organization for Women, now, the 1970 protests focused on employment discrimination, political equity, abortion, free childcare, and equality in marriage. All of these issues foreshadowed the backlash against feminist goals in the 1970s. Not only would feminism face opposition from other women who valued traditional homemaker roles to which feminists objected, the feminist movement would also fracture internally as minority women challenged white feminist racism and lesbians vied for more prominence within feminist organizations. American environmentalism's significant gains during the 1960s emerged as part of Americans' recreational use of nature. Post-war Americans backpacked, went to the beach, fished, and joined birding organizations in greater numbers than ever before. These experiences, along with increased formal education, made Americans more aware of threats to the environment and, more consequentially, to themselves. Many of these threats increased in the post-war years as developers bulldozed open space for suburbs and new hazards emerged from industrial and nuclear pollutants. By the time biologist Rachel Carson published her landmark book, Silent Spring, in 1962, the nascent environmentalism had emerged in America. Silent Spring stood out as an unparalleled argument for the interconnectedness of ecological and human health. Pesticides, Carson argued, also posed a threat to human health, and their overuse threatened the ecosystems that supported food production. Carson's argument was compelling to many Americans, including President Kennedy, but was virulently opposed by chemical industries that suggested the book was a product of an emotional woman, not a scientist. After Silent Spring, the social, and I'm sorry for laughing at that, I am on Carson's side on that. That is just such a ridiculous argument. After Silent Spring, the social and intellectual currents of environmentalism continued to expand rapidly. It's culminated in the largest demonstration in history, Earth Day, on April 22nd, 1970, and a decade of lawmaking that significantly restructured the American government. Even before the massive gathering on Earth Day, lawmakers from the local to the federal level had pushed for and achieved regulations to clean up air and water. President Richard Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act into law in 1970, requiring environmental impact statements for any project directed or funded by the federal government. He also created the Environmental Protection Agency, the first agency charged with studying, regulating, and disseminating knowledge about the environment. A raft of laws followed that were designed to offer increased protection for air, water, endangered species, and natural areas. The decade's activism manifested across the world. It even affected the Catholic Church. The Second Vatican Council, called by Pope John to modernize the Church and bring it in closer dialogue with the non-Catholic world, operated from 1962 to 1965, when it proclaimed multiple reforms, including the vernacular Mass in local languages rather than Latin, and a greater role for lay people, especially women, in the Church. Many Catholic churches adopted a more informal contemporary styles. Many conservative Catholics recoiled as what they perceived as rapid and dangerous changes, but the Vatican's reforms in many ways created the modern Catholic Church. Conclusion. In 1969, Americans hailed the moon landing as a profound victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. This landmark achievement fulfilled the promise of the late John F. Kennedy, who declared in 1961 that the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But while Neil Armstrong said his steps marked one giant leap for mankind, and Americans marveled at the achievement, the brief moment of wonder only punctuated years of turmoil. The Vietnam War disillusioned a generation. Riots rocked cities, protests hit campuses, and the assassinations robbed the nation of many of its leaders. The forward-thinking spirits of a complex decade had waned. Uncertainty loomed.